After law school and when I was 1 year into my master's program at Makerere University, I applied to be a volunteer at Refugee Law Project, an organization that works on forced migrants. So we used to work with asylum seekers and refugees.
I started out working with refugees. I used to work with the Refugee Law Project at the School of Law at Makerere University. And there I was working in the legal department. But as we were trying to work with refugees, helping them with the legal aspects of trying to get asylum, we realized that there were many challenges, social and economic challenges that stood in the way of the work that we were doing. Looking around from the refugee perspective and the IDP perspective, it became clear that there are those basic needs that people have. Many times when we got to push for some of the social services for the refugees, you would get the response, if nationals are not getting this, how do you expect us to avail it for the refugees?
But what was even very sad was social and economic rights, which included education and health, were far from being realized by refugees and asylum seekers.
And I was trying to think through this whole idea of how do we intervene in such a scenario. And that is when I got the idea of establishing the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights. For most parts, the law was clear. You have a right to vote. You have freedom from torture. You have, for the most part, the law was clear. But even looking at our constitution, you see that there are gaps in terms of the protection of social and economic rights.
I was so passionate about the issues of education. And I was like, no, I think personally I could drive the program, to look into the different things, because as an organization, we set out to say, everyone should have decent quality education.
After writing the concept for the initiative, I interested colleagues to join in, and that is how we conceptualized the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights. And basically, we make legal and human rights contributions to the whole social and economic rights field.
And that's the mantra or the niche that we move along with in our programming is on the right to education.
Now, education being one of the core areas of work that we started with, we used to do continuous monitoring of the right to education, and mostly we focus on basic education. So we are mostly looking at primary and secondary education. But consistently, there were reports that were coming out to show that, there is a decline in performance of government publicly funded education. So we did a budget analysis of the funding over 5 years for education. We realized that with the universal primary education, the capitation grant had never increased since the start, and we were in 10 years by that time. And we were like, this was accounting for a lot of the inefficiencies that we are seeing in the public education sector. So here they call it the capitation grant.
And when we went to do research before that case, we found that, many girls, there were issues on menstrual hygiene. They never had rooms where to change from, especially if you get, abrupt periods. They're young, they're not able to count their days and say, my period is coming on this day. But also, I think equally important was because in most of the schools, especially in the rural areas, we have latrines. So many of them didn't have shutters, but that money can be used for shutters. So the big girls could not go to the toilets. So many of them, resorted to going back home. And of course, the dropouts, marriage, and so on and so forth. Those were some of the issues. And we thought, if this money is further cut, some of these things are not going to be done in schools.
So what the schools were doing instead, they started innovating on how to make money. And they would come up with non-tuition fees to be paid by the parents of the children. So in the end, you would find that the amount of money that our parents still had to use in order to get their child into even a universal primary education school was a lot. And many children were beginning to fall out of the education system. And yet the whole point of coming up with UPE was to increase access to education. Then we went back to a situation like we were prior to UPE, to the removal of tuition, where now parents started weighing who are they taking to school and who are they not taking to school. And definitely that affects the girl child more. So in that case, we argued a lot about the girl child being disproportionately impacted by the limited funding towards universal primary education.
So we took this matter to court in 2014.
And it immediately sparked a lot of national debate. And the ministry had to come out, because in bringing that case, we were also strategic and requested one of the members of parliament on the education committee to join us as a plaintiff. So it was the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights, and then Honorable Joseph Sewungu, who was a member of parliament, and we knew that he would really bring the issue to parliament immediately. And indeed, that is what happened, because he's also a popular MP. So also in terms of the media getting interested to ask him why he is in court, it really worked very well, because we got lots and lots of media interviews.
Initially, the state attorney said, these are issues for the executive. The court has no business, in entertaining such issues. And if court entertained this matter, would put a hold or a stall on the budget process, which was not true. The country could not be held on ransom because of this case that we had taken. But because the media blew the case to levels that we never expected, there are people who had not been consulted that picked on the issue and started, moving with it. And, there was a lot of, radio airtime that was given to us, TV airtime, please come, let's speak about this. And all those were spaces for the public to say, this is gross, because in many cases, the budget documents are so huge, you must have interest to open them.
To one extent that the ministry and the Minister for Education had to come out by themselves, and they make a commitment before Parliament to increase the capitation grant before the case went very far. Now, at primary level, there are more public schools and more government grant-aided schools that you would technically consider public schools. So approaching it that way was quite useful. At secondary level, we had a situation where government had few what you would call public schools, But with the introduction of universal primary education, that means the enrollment into secondary education was also dramatically going to go up. So once they established the universal secondary education to kind of take on the numbers that were coming from universal primary, then government realized they did not have enough public schools to take in these children. So they came up with the idea of a public-private partnership scheme where they would partner with private schools to be able to take in government-sponsored students. Now, what's happened is that they later realized that that money was little for them to be able to manage the schools, and also many private students who were enrolled in those schools exited because they felt they could not subsidize the government students who are being enrolled at a lesser fee. And of course, this money was not enough to run these schools, but also make a profit for the owner, because these were private for-profit schools. But also they got again into this thing of asking for many school requirements that surpassed the tuition that people were supposed to pay. And these schools also became unaffordable. So there were gender elements in that because mostly it is the girls who ended up in those schools.
So in 2016, we started on research on public-private partnerships. And what is the impact of these private partnerships on the education, especially for vulnerable children?
So you find that the PPP schools ended up having the poor children, the girl children, the disadvantaged children in many respects. And yet now evidence was beginning to come out that because of the shortcuts they are making in terms of quality, in terms of ensuring that they have to make money, the outcomes in education were also different. So PPP schools were performing poorly.
We went to court basically to say there is inequality and discrimination in this situation where the state is funding Ugandan children at different levels, disadvantaging them.
And we argued that partly this resulted from the way the government was financing, but also the whole conceptualization of the PPP scheme.
So when we filed in August 2016, it took the state 1 full year to put in a written statement of defense. One of the things they thought was very strong for them, they were like, whatever the private schools are doing, it's none of our business. It's them, which was gross. Like if you open up, if there is liberalization, you have a role to regulate and monitor to ensure that the girl child, the vulnerable groups, the children with disability are not negatively impacted by the actions of private actors. And then finally, we got judgment in July 2019. The students that were still on government sponsorship and doing government sponsorship on public-private partnership, the government increased the money to 55,000 Uganda shillings for the continuing students. There were some people within the ministry who said, you guys are backstabbers. Why didn't you first come to us? Why didn't we dialogue on this, But because we had built a very good relationship with them, would make them look on the bright side, especially those who are within the department that oversees private schools. We said it's in your interest for this matter to be decided, and the government takes decisions on increasing capitation in these schools such that they can function. And I'm glad to mention that when we are part of the government planning for the next education strategic plan, there was recourse to the Abidjan Principles, which talks largely about a lot of issues for vulnerable groups. And we were glad that at that point, there had been an adoption of the Abidjan principles, which speak very highly and broadly around the right to education, both state education, but also where there is private involvement in delivery of education. And she incorporated a lot of beautiful principles to make sure that the states gets to appreciate that when they are designing and implementing, their policy and programs, they had to make sure that they don't leave anyone behind. They had to make sure that if they are working on education programs, every child is catered for.
The government has now decided to increase the public schools. The Abidjan principles have a big component around public-private partnerships and what kind of, what they should look like, what kind of schools should qualify to enter into a PPP with government.
And of course, there have been discussions around what should be the next form of PPPs.
They are rethinking it to make sure that they come up with something that is more workable in terms of the partnerships they enter into.
The conversation continues. We hope to engage very much around this, because at the end of the day, once those structures are not functioning, they are the starting point. If they are not functioning, the vulnerable people are the ones who are at a disadvantage.